August 6th, 1945. You have been told that 2 atomic bombs ended the Second World War. That is not a lie. But it is only half the truth, and the other half has been sitting in the dark for 80 years, waiting for someone to turn on the light. On that morning, a single American aircraft turned in the sky over a Japanese city, and in one blinding instant, Hiroshima ceased to exist. The world would remember that morning forever. The mushroom cloud. The shadow of a human being burned into stone. The dawn of a terrible new age. But 800 miles to the north, along a frontier most people had already forgotten, something else was gathering in the dark. Not a bomb. Not a single weapon. An entire army. More than 1.5 million men, moving into position under cover of night, waiting for a signal that was only days away. And when it came, they would erase an army of nearly 1 million Japanese soldiers from the map of the earth in 11 days. This is the story the atomic bomb buried. The last great campaign of the Second World War. A reckoning 40 years in the making, paid in full on the frozen ground of Manchuria, and then quietly forgotten by almost everyone who lived it. To understand what happened in that summer, you cannot begin in 1945. You have to go back 4 decades, to a wound that never healed. The year was 1904, on the night of February 8th. Without a declaration of war, without a warning of any kind, Japanese destroyers slipped through the darkness toward the Russian naval fortress at Port Arthur and struck the fleet as it lay peacefully at anchor. There was only fire on the water, and the shock of a great empire caught sleeping. It was the opening move of a war that would humble Russia before the entire world. What came next was a slow, grinding catastrophe. The Japanese laid siege to Port Arthur, and for months, under a general named Nogi Marisuke, they threw wave after wave of infantry against the Russian fortifications. The hills around that harbor became slaughterhouses. On a single piece of high ground the maps called 203-meter hill, thousands upon thousands of young Japanese men were fed into machine gun fire until the slopes were carpeted with the dead. Nogi himself lost 2 sons in that war. By the time Port Arthur finally fell in January of 1905, the victory had cost the Japanese tens of thousands of lives. It was a triumph written entirely in blood. Then came Mukden. In the frozen weeks of February and March 1905, more than 500,000 men collided in what was, up to that moment, the largest land battle in the history of the world. Both armies bled themselves white in the snow. But it was the Russians who broke first, who abandoned the field and streamed north in a long, humiliating retreat. And then came the sea. The Russian Baltic fleet had sailed halfway around the world to save the war in the east. A voyage of 18,000 nautical miles, around the whole of Europe and Africa and Asia, their crews exhausted, their hulls fouled, their coal running low. But by the time they neared the war zone, Port Arthur had already fallen. The fortress they had been sent to relieve was gone. Now they had only one desperate hope left, to slip through the narrow waters and reach the safety of Vladivostok. On the 27th of May, in the strait beside the island of Tsushima, the fleet of Admiral Togo Heihachiro was waiting for them. What happened there was not a battle. It was an execution. In a matter of hours, the Russian fleet was shattered. Great steel ships rolled over and sank with thousands of men still trapped inside them. The water burned, and Japanese losses were almost nothing at all. It was the most one-sided naval victory in the age of steel, and it announced to the world a truth that the great powers of Europe were not ready to hear. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had crushed a European empire in open war. That September, at a quiet naval town in New Hampshire, the Treaty of Portsmouth made the humiliation official. Japan took the lease of Port Arthur. Japan took the southern half of Sakhalin Island. And Japan won a free hand in Korea, the peninsula it would swallow whole 5 years later. In 1910, Russia, the great empire of the East, was forced to pull back, defeated, diminished, exposed before the eyes of the world. But the shame did not stay on the battlefield. It followed the soldiers home. It helped light the fires of revolution in that same year of 1905, forcing a reluctant Tsar to bend and grant reforms he never intended to honor. And when that Tsar himself was swept away 12 years later, when the whole empire collapsed and a new power calling itself the Soviet Union rose out of the ruins, the wound did not close. The flags had changed. The rulers had changed. The system had been turned upside down. But the memory of 1905 remained. passed from one generation of Russian soldiers to the next like an inheritance nobody wanted and nobody could put down. The men who would one day rebuild the Russian army studied the disasters of that war, the way a surgeon studies a fatal mistake, searching for the exact moment everything went wrong. The indecision at the top, the rotten leadership, the obsolete weapons, the generals who never adapted. They swore, in the deepest part of the national soul, that it would never happen again. Somewhere inside that vow, the campaign of 1945 was already being written. But revenge needs an enemy. And by the summer of 1945, the enemy waiting across that frontier was no longer the force the world still believed it to be. They called it the Kwantung Army. For a full generation, the name had carried the weight of terror across all of Asia. It had been born, fittingly enough, out of the very war that had humiliated Russia, formed to guard Japan's new prizes around Port Arthur after 1905. But it did not remain a quiet garrison for long. By the 1930s, the Kwantung Army had become the sharpened tip of Japanese ambition on the Asian mainland, so aggressive, so arrogant, so independent, that it frequently acted without waiting for orders from Tokyo at all. It was less an army serving a government than an army that had decided to run its own war. In 1931, its officers staged an explosion on a stretch of railway near Mukden, blamed the sabotage on the Chinese, and used the lie as a pretext to seize all of Manchuria. They carved a puppet state out of the conquered land and gave it a name, Manchukuo. They installed a puppet ruler on its throne. At its height, this was an army of over 700,000 men, hardened by years of occupation and slaughter, feared from Siberia to the South China Sea, fielding some of the finest soldiers the Empire of Japan could produce. That was the legend. Here is the reality. By August 1945, the Kwantung Army was a ghost wearing the uniform of the thing it used to be. As American forces clawed their way across the Pacific, island by bloody island, Tokyo had reached into Manchuria again and again and stripped it to the bone. The best divisions were gone, shipped south to die on the beaches of the Philippines, in the caves of Okinawa, on 100 nameless atolls. The modern equipment was gone. The hard veterans were gone. What Tokyo left behind was a name and an empty shell. Look closely at the numbers, and the whole illusion falls apart. On paper, 31 divisions. In truth, only 6 of them had even existed before January of 1945. The rest had been conjured out of thin air in the final desperate months of the war, filled out with raw conscripts, aging reservists, and boys pulled straight from farms and schoolrooms. Some of them handed a rifle and a few weeks of training before being sent to stand watch over the edge of a dying empire. Entire units were rated by Japan's own officers at less than 15% ready for combat. The weapons told the same story of decay. The tanks were light, thin-skinned relics of the early 1930s. Their little guns barely able to scratch the armor of a modern enemy. The artillery was starved of shells. The aircraft, what few remained, were obsolete designs, and many of them could not even leave the ground for lack of fuel. And the men knew, that is the part the numbers can never show you. These soldiers knew their home cities were burning under American bombs. They knew the great Imperial Navy was at the bottom of the sea. They knew, standing their lonely watch over that vast and silent frontier, that the war was already lost, and that they were being asked to defend the indefensible with weapons that belonged to another age. Fear does something to men in that position. It hollows them out from the inside. Long before the first shot is ever fired, this was the army the world still feared. A reputation that had long outlived the reality behind it. That is the first hard truth of this story. The million-man giant was hollow. Here is the second, and it is stranger still. Japan's leaders were not blind. They could see the end coming as clearly as anyone, and they had built their entire strategy for survival around a single, desperate hope. The hope that one nation on earth might still save them. That nation was the Soviet Union. It seems impossible when you say it out loud. The Soviets and the Japanese were enemies by every measure of ideology and history and blood. But between the two of them lay a neutrality pact, signed back in 1941 and technically still in force. And so, as the American noose drew tighter and tighter, Japanese diplomats turned to Moscow, quietly at first, then urgently, then almost frantically, begging Stalin to serve as a go-between, to broker some kind of peace that might spare Japan from the nightmare of unconditional surrender and preserve the sacred throne of the emperor. They were pleading for their lives with the one nation on earth that had already decided, in secret, to destroy them. Because months earlier, at a resort town on the Black Sea called Yalta, Stalin had made a promise to Roosevelt and to Churchill. In exchange for the very territories Japan had torn away in 1905, southern Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, the lease of Port Arthur itself, the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan, not someday, not eventually. Within 3 months of the defeat of Germany, Germany surrendered in the first week of May. Do the simple arithmetic, and the date arrives with the cold precision of a sentence being carried out. 3 months from early May, to the week, to the very day, while Japanese envoys sat in Moscow, waiting by their telephones for an answer that would never come. 1.5 million Soviet soldiers were already flowing east, day after day, across the endless breadth of Siberia, toward a frontier the Japanese still believed no army on earth could cross in time. The savior they were praying to was, at that very moment, sharpening the blade meant for their throat. And on the far side of the mountains, in the deserts and the forests of Manchuria, the ghost army waited. It waited facing the wrong direction. It waited expecting the wrong season. It waited preparing for a war that was about to arrive years ahead of its schedule, and in a form its commanders could not begin to imagine. The storm was 3 days away. The Japanese had prepared for an attack. They had simply prepared for the wrong one. For years, their strategists had bent over the map of that vast frontier and arrived at a comfortable, reasonable conclusion. If the Soviets ever came, they would surely come from the east, along the corridors where the railways ran, where a modern army could actually be supplied. And so that is where the Japanese looked. That is where they poured their concrete and dug their trenches. That is where they waited. They were staring at the front door, while the enemy quietly climbed over a wall they were certain no one could climb, because the force gathering against them was unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced, or ever imagined facing. This was not the clumsy, ill-led Russian army that had stumbled at Mukden 40 years before. This was the army that had marched, step by bloody step, all the way into the ruins of Berlin. 4 years of the most savage warfare in human history had burned away everything soft, everything slow, everything that hesitated. What remained was a machine, and it had learned its terrible trade against the Germans, who were, man for man, the finest soldiers in the world. That is a point worth pausing on, because it explains everything that followed. The way of war the Soviets were about to unleash on Manchuria had not been dreamed up in a classroom. It had been paid for in 4 years of catastrophe and slaughter on the Eastern Front, in the frozen death of 1 million men outside Moscow, in the rubble of Stalingrad, in the vast tank graveyards of Kursk. Every lesson had a price tag written in Russian blood. And by 1945, the bill had been paid in full. The Soviets had graduated from the hardest school the world has ever known. Nearly 1.5 million men now stood ready in the East. Thousands of tanks, the battle-proven T-34s, and the heavy steel monsters that had broken the German panzer divisions, rolling now alongside American-built Sherman tanks that had been shipped east under Lend-Lease. Thousands of aircraft, an ocean of artillery, and behind all of it, a doctrine the Japanese had no answer for. The Soviets called it deep operations. The idea was simple, and it was merciless. You did not line up politely and grind yourself to pieces against the enemy's strongest points. You found the seams, the weak places between the strong ones, and you tore straight through them. And then you drove deep, hundreds of miles deep, into the soft and undefended interior, far behind the front. You left the great fortresses sealed and isolated in your wake, their guns pointing at empty air, their garrisons cut off from a war that had already raced past them. You did not push the enemy backward. You reached all the way around him, and you swallowed him whole. If the Japanese had wanted to know what that felt like, they only had to remember, because they had already tasted it once, 6 years before, and they had chosen to forget the lesson. In the summer of 1939, along a disputed stretch of the Manchurian border near a river called Khalkhin Gol, the Kwantung Army had picked a fight with the Soviet Union it did not need. The Japanese expected an easy victory over what they assumed was a backward and poorly led enemy. Instead, they ran into a rising Soviet commander named Georgy Zhukov, a man the whole world would come to know a few years later. Zhukov massed his tanks in secret, waited, and then struck with the sudden combined assault of armor, artillery, aircraft, and infantry that encircled the Japanese forces and annihilated them. It was a humiliating, bloody defeat, and it carried a clear warning about exactly how the Soviets fought a modern war. The Kwantung Army had felt that hammer once, and still, in 1945 it stood waiting behind static lines and fixed fortifications, as if Khalkhin Gol had never happened. The warning had been written in their own dead, and they had filed it away and moved on. Now the hammer was coming again, and this time there would be no border skirmish. This time it was the whole weight of the Red Army. The attack would come as three enormous blows landing at once. From the east, Marshal Kirill Meretskov, driving inland from the coast through some of the most heavily fortified ground on the entire frontier. From the north, General Maxim Purkayev, pressing down across the great rivers. And from the west, out of the empty deserts of Mongolia, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, holding the single sharpest blade of the whole operation ready in his hand. That blade was the 6th Guards Tank Army. Its commander was a 45-year-old veteran named Andrei Kravchenko, a hard, capable man who had fought his way through Stalingrad, through the steel storm of Kursk, all the way to the gates of Vienna. And he had been handed what looked, on paper, like an impossible task. Between his tanks and the beating heart of Manchuria stood the Greater Khingan Mountains. The Japanese had barely bothered to defend that range at all, and why would they? It was a wall of rock and thin, dry air, its passes narrow and treacherous, its slopes brutal, its heights choked with desert on one side and empty wilderness on the other. No modern army, the Japanese reasoned, weighed down with tanks and fuel trucks and heavy guns, could possibly drag itself across that barrier in any useful amount of time. The mountains themselves would do the defending. Of this, the Kwantung Army was absolutely certain. They were about to learn the price of certainty. Just after midnight on the 9th of August, 1945, the storm broke. There was no long thunder of artillery to announce it, no bombardment to give the defenders warning. The Soviets wanted surprise, and they simply reached out and took it. Across a front as wide as all of Western Europe, 3 massive army groups surged forward in the darkness at the very same hour, and Kravchenko's tanks drove straight into the mountains the Japanese had sworn were impassable. Picture it for a moment, column after column of armor, grinding up slopes no tank was ever designed to climb, engines screaming and overheating in the thin mountain air, crews wrestling their machines up grades that seemed to defy the laws of physics, fighting the terrain itself far harder than they fought any human enemy. And they did not slow down. In a single day, the lead elements covered nearly 100 miles. In a single day, they crossed a barrier the Japanese had measured in weeks, and they crossed it running 3 full days ahead of their own ambitious schedule. There is a moment worth holding on to here, because it captures the entire disaster from the other side of the line. A senior Japanese officer, taken prisoner later, admitted the plain truth of what had happened. When word first came that the Soviets had reached the mountains, he said, "We were calm. We expected the Khingan to break them, to exhaust them, to turn them back the way it would turn back any army. And then, without warning, their tanks and their guns and their infantry were simply through, pouring down onto the open plain behind us. The wall had held for no one. The door the Japanese had never bothered to lock was already swinging wide open, and the enemy was inside the house, far to the north. Meanwhile, General Purkayev was fighting a different kind of war, a war against water. His front faced the great rivers of the region, the Amur and the Ussuri, wide and cold and swollen with the summer rains. There were no easy roads here, only the barrier of the current itself. So the Soviets came by boat. The gunboats and armored vessels of the Amur River flotilla churned across the water under fire, ferrying men and machines to the far bank, while assault troops waded ashore into the Japanese fortifications and began the slow, ugly business of clearing them one by one. From these crossings, Purkayev's men pushed inland along the Sungari River, driving toward the city of Harbin, closing the northern jaw of a trap that was tightening across the whole of Manchuria. But it is Kravchenko's racing tanks in the west that reveal the strangest twist of the entire campaign. Because in those first astonishing days, the Soviets came very close to being defeated, not by the Japanese, but by an enemy they could not shoot at. They were moving too fast. That is the hidden truth that the maps and the arrows never show you. The tanks that had torn across the desert and burst through the mountains were burning fuel at a rate that no supply line on Earth could keep up with. They outran their own trucks. They outran their own railheads. They outran the whole logistical tail that was supposed to feed them. And deep in the Manchurian interior, hundreds of miles from the border they had crossed only days before, columns of armor that had smashed everything in their path began to cough and sputter and roll to a dead stop, not from Japanese shells, from empty fuel tanks. An army can die of its own success. Kravchenko's spearhead sat stranded and silent on the open plain, out of gas, out of reach of their own supplies, suddenly vulnerable in a way no enemy had ever managed to make them. And so the Soviets did something extraordinary. They took to the air. Transport planes began flying fuel forward, drum by heavy drum, bumping down onto rough improvised airstrips and open fields to reach the stalled columns, keeping those iron blades turning by the very thinnest of margins. Think about what that means. The single greatest threat to the fastest military advance of the entire Second World War was not the Kwantung Army at all. It was distance. It was the sheer, punishing size of the ground they were conquering, and the Soviets beat it from the sky. Now, hold on to one thing here, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. It would be very easy, watching those tanks pour unstoppably across Manchuria, to conclude that this was a walk, a parade, one army politely stepping aside for a better one. It was not. Where the Japanese could fight, they fought with a ferocity that should never, ever be forgotten. The heaviest of it came at a city called Mudanjiang, an important rail hub, where Marshal Meretskov's men from the east ran headlong into some of the last soldiers in all of Manchuria who still had teeth. And here, the raw conscripts, the boys and the aging reservists that the entire world had already written off as worthless, showed exactly what they were willing to do. They had nothing that could stop a T-34. Their little anti-tank guns bounced off Soviet armor like pebbles. So they used the only weapon they had left. They used themselves. Men strapped explosives to their own bodies. They dug shallow holes in the roads and waited sometimes for hours for the sound of approaching tanks. Then they rose and threw themselves beneath the tracks. The Soviet soldiers called them the condemned. But these were not fanatics in the way we often imagine. They were frightened young men, far from home, who knew the war was already lost and chose to die where they stood rather than run. Not because the Soviets had condemned them, but because they had condemned themselves, walking with a terrible calm toward a death they had already accepted as certain. It was horrifying, it was militarily futile, and it was human, achingly, unbearably human, in a way that the clean sweeping arrows on a strategy map can never show you. These were not fanatics in some cartoon sense. They were frightened young men, tens of thousands of miles from the villages where they were born, holding a line that every single one of them knew was already lost, and choosing to die exactly where they stood rather than run, around Mudanjiang, and at grim border fortresses with names like Hutu and Hailar. These forgotten men inflicted the great majority of the real casualties the Soviets suffered in the entire 11-day campaign. Consider Hutu for a moment, because it tells you everything about the Japanese soldiers' war. It was a fortified position along the border, held by a garrison that included civilians and workers as well as troops. When the Soviets came, that garrison did not withdraw, and it did not surrender when the situation became hopeless. It fought on, cut off, surrounded, pounded by heavy artillery, its defenders dying in the tunnels and the concrete. It fought on even after the emperor himself had already announced that the war was over. Word of the surrender either never reached them or was simply refused. They held out for days past the end, in a battle that had already lost all meaning, until almost every last man was dead. The giant was hollow, but the men left trapped inside it bled and died as though it were made of iron. And then, in the middle of the smoke and the racing armor and the burning fuel, there came a moment so strange it reads like something out of a novel. In just 11 days, from the night of August 9th to the 20th, the main resistance of the Kwantung Army had been broken. While the tanks were still fighting their way inland, the Soviets played another card entirely. They dropped small teams of paratroopers far ahead of the ground forces, straight down onto the airfields and the nerve centers of the collapsing empire. gambling that raw shock and speed would carry the day before anyone thought to organize a defense. At the airfield outside Mukden, one of these small parties came down out of the sky and moved quickly to seize the terminal building. And there, in the noise and the confusion, they came upon a cluster of frightened, well-dressed officials, standing on the tarmac, waiting for a plane. At the very center of the group stood a slight, bespectacled man of 39. It was Puyi, the last emperor of China, the living puppet the Japanese had lifted onto the throne of Manchukuo, the human symbol they had used for 14 long years to give their conquest a face and a flag. And now, with his masters disintegrating all around him, he had come to this airfield with one last desperate plan: to board a plane and flee to Japan before the Soviets could reach him. He was only hours too late. A mere handful of Soviet paratroopers, dropped from the sky with a tiny fraction of the men guarding that field, had captured the emperor of an entire empire without firing a shot. There would be no flight to Tokyo. There would be no comfortable exile. The living figurehead of Japan's grand design for all of Asia was now, in a single afternoon, a prisoner, and the throne he had sat upon for 14 years was already worth precisely nothing. The map of Manchuria was coming apart at every seam at once. In the east, Meretskov's men had pushed past the fortresses and the fanatics, and were now driving hard for the coast, and for the great peninsula of Liaodong that lay beyond it. And out there, at the very tip of that peninsula, defended now by nothing but a broken and demoralized garrison, sat the one place on the entire map that mattered more than any rail junction or river crossing in Manchuria: Port Arthur, the harbor where all of it had begun, the fortress where Russia's 40-year humiliation had started, on a dark February night in 1904. The Soviet spearheads were driving straight toward it now, and every single mile they gained carried them closer, not just to a military victory, but to the settling of the oldest debt those men had ever carried. They were almost there. On the 15th of August, a voice that almost no Japanese citizen had ever heard came crackling out over the radio. It was the Emperor, Hirohito himself, speaking directly to his people for the first time in the long sacred history of the throne, telling them that the war was over. He spoke of a new and most cruel weapon. He spoke, very carefully, of a war situation that had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He did not have to name the storm that was breaking across Manchuria at that very moment. Every man who understood the map already knew exactly what was happening in the north. But here is the sharpest question in the entire story, one historians still argue about today. What actually broke Japan's will to keep fighting? Was it the atomic bombs, or was it the sudden collapse of the Kwantung Army? Consider the timeline. Cold and hard and stripped of sentiment, Hiroshima was destroyed on the 6th of August. And in the days that immediately followed, Japan's leaders did not surrender. They kept fighting. More than that, they kept hoping. They kept pleading with Moscow to broker a peace. The single most terrible weapon in the history of mankind had just been dropped on one of their cities, and the government's response was still to sit and wait by the telephone for the Soviet Union to answer their request for mediation. Then, just after midnight on the 9th, the Soviets finally answered, not with words, with 1.5 million men. And within days, the same leadership that had endured the atomic bomb, that had already endured months of American firebombing that killed more of their people than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, finally, completely broke. Some historians look at that sequence of events and draw a stark conclusion. The bomb was a horror, they argue, but it was a horror Japan's rulers believed, in their own twisted calculation, that they could still somehow endure and spin into a negotiated end to the war. The Soviet invasion was something else entirely. It killed the last hope. There would be no mediator now, because the mediator had become the executioner. There would be no soft landing, no conditional peace, no preserved bargaining position. There was only a two-front war against the two most powerful nations on the face of the earth, and no way out of it but total surrender. Other historians hold, just as firmly, that the bombs were the decisive blow, that they were the thing that finally gave a proud and cornered leadership the excuse it needed to lay down its arms without losing all honor. The honest answer, the one the evidence best supports, is that it was almost certainly both at once. Two hammer blows landing within the same 48 hours. A combination that shattered a deadlock nothing else had been able to move. But do not ever let anyone tell you that the campaign in Manchuria was a mere footnote to the bomb. In the room where Japan's fate was decided, The collapse of the mighty Kwantung Army was not simply the end of the war. It may very well have been the thing that ended it. And as the surrender rippled outward across the empire, the campaign began to reveal its darkest corners. Somewhere in Manchuria, inside a complex that the outside world was not supposed to know existed, men were burning evidence as fast as their hands could work. This was the domain of Unit 731, behind its walls, under the direction of a military physician named Ishii Shiro. The Japanese had spent years conducting biological and chemical warfare research on living human beings. Prisoners, men, women, and children. Treated not as people, but as raw material for experiments too monstrous to describe here in any detail. As the Soviet armies closed in, the order came down to erase all of it. The buildings were dynamited into rubble. The remaining prisoners were murdered to leave no witnesses. And the records, the precious data gathered from all that suffering, were carried out on the backs of fleeing staff. And here is the twist that should make your blood run cold, even now. Most of them got away with it. Ishii and the leaders of that program did not hang for what they had done. In the years after the war, the two victorious powers took two very different paths. The Soviet Union put a dozen members of Unit 731 on trial for war crimes at the city of Khabarovsk and convicted them. But the United States made a quiet and shameful bargain. American authorities granted secret immunity to Ishii and the senior men of Unit 731 in exchange for handing over the data they had collected from their victims. The results of those human experiments were judged too valuable to the coming Cold War to let a little thing like justice get in the way. The worst crimes of that entire theater of the war were not punished by the men who won it. In the end, they were purchased. But for the ordinary soldiers of the Kwantung Army, there was no bargain, and no immunity, and no escape. The 11-day war was over. For nearly 600,000 of them. By the Soviets' own count, the real ordeal was only just beginning. They laid down their weapons expecting to be sent home. Instead, long grey columns of them were turned north and marched toward the railheads, then packed into freight cars and carried away, deep into the vast, frozen interior of the Soviet Union, Siberia, the coal mines, the timber forests, the labor camps that had already swallowed so many millions of men whole. Tens of thousands of them would never see Japan again. They died of cold, of hunger, of disease, of simple exhaustion, in a wilderness about as far from a Japanese home as it was possible for a human being to be. And the ones who did survive did not come back in a year, or in 2, or in 5. Some of them were not released until 1956, 11 full years after the guns had fallen silent. Men who had long ago been given up for dead walked back into villages that had already mourned them and moved on, strangers now in their own country, carrying inside them a silence that most of them would keep for the rest of their lives. And it was not only the soldiers who paid. More than 1 million Japanese civilians had come to Manchuria over the years. Ordinary families lured across the sea by government promises of free land and a place in the great empire. Farmers, wives, small children. When the army that was supposed to protect them collapsed and ran, these settlers were simply abandoned. The very soldiers who had encouraged them to come to Manchuria for a better life now left them behind wives, children, and elderly parents as they retreated south. They were left to face the Soviet advance and the rising anger of the local population with almost nothing. What happened to them in those weeks is one of the great unspoken tragedies of the entire war. Families died together on the roads, of hunger and exposure and violence. Mothers, unable to carry their children another step through what was coming, faced choices that no human being should ever be forced to make. And thousands of Japanese children were left behind entirely. Some were handed in desperation to Chinese farming families who took them in and raised them as their own. Some were simply lost. For decades afterward, these lost children, grown now into middle age, would search for the truth of who they had been. And some of them did not learn their own names, did not find their own blood, until they were old men and women standing in a country they no longer remembered. The victory was total, but the cost of it, for the ordinary people caught underneath, is very nearly beyond counting. And even the fighting itself did not stop when the emperor commanded that it should. Days after that radio broadcast reached across the empire, on a windswept, fog-bound island in the Kuril chain called Shumshu, Soviet troops came ashore and ran straight into Japanese defenders, who either had never received the order to surrender or would not accept it. There, on that cold rock at the very edge of the world, they fought what turned out to be the last tank battle of the entire Second World War. A savage little fight over a scrap of ground that almost no one has ever heard of. The final dying spasm of a conflict that had consumed the whole earth. But in the mind of the man sitting in the Kremlin, all of it, the tanks and the camps and the burning cities, served one single, ancient purpose. And on the peninsula, where the entire story had begun, that purpose was finally fulfilled. Soviet forces took Port Arthur, the harbor where Russia had been humiliated on a February night in 1904, the fortress whose long and bloody fall had announced to the world that the great Russian Empire could be beaten by an Asian power. 40 years later, the red banner went up over that same ground, and this time there was no siege, and there was barely a shot fired in anger. The Japanese defenders there simply surrendered. On the 2nd of September, with the formal instrument of surrender being signed at that very hour aboard an American battleship in Tokyo Bay, Joseph Stalin spoke to his people over the radio, and he did not speak of communism, or of the workers of the world, or of the bright future. He reached instead all the way back into the past. The defeat of 1904, he told them, had left a bitter and painful stain on the memory of his whole generation. For 40 years, he said, the men of his age had waited for this day to come. Now, at last, it had come. Southern Sakhalin, taken back. The Kuril Islands, taken. Port Arthur, taken. Every last scrap of ground that had been lost in that old humiliation, recovered in 11 days. The wound of 1905 was, in the official telling, finally and completely closed. That was the meaning the Soviet state chose to give it. A reckoning. A debt at last paid in full. A national shame washed clean by the treads of 10,000 tanks. But strip away the propaganda and the grand talk of destiny, and what remains is something harder and truer and far more human. An army that was already a hollow ghost, destroyed by an army that had spent 4 years perfecting the art of destruction against a far deadlier foe. 600,000 men carried off to labor and die at the frozen edge of the world, 1 million settlers abandoned to the roads, thousands of children lost forever to their own families. A monstrous secret buried, deliberately, by the very people who should have dragged it into the light. And a campaign that may well have been as decisive as the atomic bomb itself in ending the greatest war in all of human history. Remembered today by almost no one who won it. The bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the images that defined the end of the Second World War. They filled the newsreels, and the history books, and the memory of the entire world. They are, for most of us, where the story of that war simply stops. And there, in their vast and permanent shadow, the 11 days that shattered a 1,000,000-man army, that avenged a 40-year-old defeat, and that helped bring the final curtain down on the deadliest conflict mankind has ever known, slipped quietly and almost completely into the dark. Not because it did not matter, but because the men who ended it, and the men who suffered and died beneath it, were never the ones who got to tell the story.